Okay, welcome to Chapter 16, and here we'll be discussing the autonomic nervous system. Now, one of the things you've got to remember about the autonomic nervous system is that it runs below the level of our conscious awareness, and its primary goal is to maintain the body's sense of balance, which is homeostasis. And there's two divisions that we'll discuss: the sympathetic division, which is nicknamed the fight or flight, and the parasympathetic division, which is nicknamed the rest and digest. And as those names imply, they have physiological responses that you would associate with those particular situations. For instance, if we talk about fight or flight, you can imagine yourself in a stressful situation. You might feel your blood pressure rising, your blood glucose going up, your respiratory rate going up, your heart rate going up. The amount of urine that you put out is going to go down, your pupils will dilate, and this is all designed to get fuel and oxygen-rich blood to the peripheral muscles so that we can deal with our situation. Rest and digest is more concerned with enhancing GI motility, increasing diuresis, lowering blood pressure and respiratory rate, and it's the system that sort of kicks in after Thanksgiving dinner on the couch. And both of these operate without us having to consciously control them, and it's a good thing that they do because the number of tasks that they perform is almost innumerable. And if we had to consciously control these tasks, we'd be pressed to try and deal with the environment around us in order to enhance our survival. So, if we look at the somatic and the autonomic nervous system, they both contain peripheral nerves that have both motor and sensory function. So you're going to see in both the somatic motor and the autonomic nerves that are mixed, nerves that are sensory or afferent, and nerves that are motor or efferent. Most of the nerves, as we're going to find out, are mixed. Among the motor neurons, some of these are somatic and innervate skeletal muscle, while some are autonomic and they innervate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So in the somatic motor system, we're talking about skeletal muscle, whereas in the autonomic nervous system, we're dealing primarily with smooth and cardiac muscle, and also the response of glands and tissues. The sensory neurons are not subdivided into somatic and autonomic since there is overlap in their function. As an example, pain receptors can stimulate both somatic and autonomic reflexes. But here we can see an example of how the autonomic and the somatic motor division of the peripheral nervous system sort of contrast with each other. Here in the somatic motor division, what we see is in the ventral horn a neuron cell body giving rise to an axon that goes through the ventral root and will eventually fuse with the dorsal root to form a spinal nerve. That nerve will contain an axon that's going to run all the way to the target, the muscle, that when it receives the innervation is going to contract, provided that we reach threshold. These are some of the fastest neurons in the body. They run at about 200 miles an hour, and they do their job very, very well, and this is under, of course, our conscious control. In the autonomic nervous system, what we see is that most of the neurons aren't found in the ventral horn. Most of them are found in the lateral horn, where there is a lateral horn, or near the gray commissure. But the motor fiber exits via the ventral root, will anastomose with the dorsal root, and then will send what we call preganglionic neuron to either an intramural or a paravertebral ganglion. Now, we got to be very clear about what we mean about those two different structures. A paravertebral ganglion lies in a very special set of structures on either side of the spinal cord called the paravertebral ganglia that run like a string of pearls on the right and the left side of the spinal cord. Whereas an intramural ganglia could be found anywhere really inside the body cavity. When we're dealing with the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, most of the preganglionic neurons are going to synapse in the paravertebral ganglia. A few of them are going to pass through to intramural ganglia, and in any case, the second neuron, the postganglionic neuron, will carry the electrical signal all the way to the target. In the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, most of these nerve leads come out near the head and the neck or near the sacrum, so it has a nickname, the craniosacral division of the ANS. Whereas in the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, most of the preganglionic neurons come out in the thoracic and the lumbar regions. These neurons are slower than the somatic motor neurons, but they're still adequate to get the job done. With regard to neurotransmitters, the somatic motor division uses acetylcholine primarily to talk to its target, skeletal muscle. In the autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons generally use acetylcholine to talk to the postganglionic neurons, and the postganglionic neurons, depending on whether they belong to the parasympathetic or sympathetic division, will use epinephrine if we're talking about a sympathetic postganglionic neuron, or we'll use primarily acetylcholine if we're talking about a parasympathetic postganglionic neuron. There are some exceptions to that. Okay, so that's the difference. It's a two-neuron system. It's slower. The neurons originate from a different point in the spinal cord, and of course, in the autonomic nervous system, we don't consciously control what's going on. So, the somatic motor division talks to skeletal muscle and provides for conscious and unconscious movement. When innervated, the skeletal muscle will contract, provided we reach threshold. And there's only one synapse, and it's quite quick. And the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. And the receptor molecules are what are termed nicotinic. Now, you might say, well, what does that mean? Well, what it means is that the receptor is shaped so that the compound nicotine will bind to it very tightly and initiate a response, in this case, an excitatory response in the target tissue. Now, as you know, we don't manufacture nicotine in our body, but we do manufacture neurotransmitters that are shaped a lot like nicotine, and they evoke the same response because of their similarity in shape. So this is an interaction that relies on tertiary and secondary structure and quaternary structure in order to be effective. The autonomic nervous system innervates smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, also glands and tissues. It's under unconscious regulation, and it targets tissues and will either stimulate them or inhibit them depending on the neurotransmitter and the nature of the receptors that are on the membrane of the target. There's two synapses. Remember that there is a synapse between the preganglionic and the postganglionic neuron. And there's also a synapse between the postganglionic neuron and the target. Acetylcholine is primarily used by the preganglionic neurons, and acetylcholine or norepinephrine is used primarily by the postganglionic neurons. Now, there are a few exceptions to this, but we'll get to those later. The receptor molecules are going to vary with the synapse and the nature of the neurotransmitter. And what you're looking at here is just a list, table 16.1, that shows you the effector, the targets for the somatic motor system, the type of regulation, the response to stimulation, the neuron arrangement, the neuron cell body location, number of synapses, the presence or absence of axon sheaths, the type of neurotransmitter used, and the type of receptor molecule. So here they're listed for the somatic, motor, and the autonomic nervous system. Both the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions are clustered in this column of information. Okay, so star this material, know it. This is perfect PRS and exam material. So let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system. It's divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, and there's also a third division called the enteric nervous system, which is basically a cluster of nerve nets that run between the various tunics that line the digestive system. Primarily, these are associated with the smooth muscle layers that you find in the digestive system. It can be thought of almost as a separate nervous system, but they get a significant amount of innervation from the ANS. The sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions supply the same organs, but they differ in a number of features, and they also differ in terms of the pathway that the nerve takes to get to the target. Frequently, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic leads to an internal organ are going to come off of different nerves. Not always, but often. The enteric nervous system has nerve plexuses in the wall of the digestive tract, and it gets contributions from sensory neurons between the GI and the central nervous system, as well as autonomic nervous system motor neurons between the central nervous system and the digestive tract, and the enteric neurons that are confined within these plexuses. What are the functions? Well, it stimulates or inhibits smooth muscle contraction, and it stimulates or inhibits glandular secretion, and it also detects changes in the content of the lumen of the GI, and the interneurons connect sensory and motor aspects of the enteric nervous system. And what you're looking at here is just a comparison between the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions with regard to the location of the postganglionic cell body, the outflow from the central nervous system with the location of the ganglia, and the number of postganglionic neurons for each preganglionic neuron, as well as the relative lengths of the neurons. But we'll go into all this in detail in just a moment. But again, star this because this is a nice summary slide. So let's start with a look at the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. This is known as the thoracocolumbar division. And the preganglionic cell bodies are generally rather short. They're found in the lateral horns of the spinal cord running from thoracic 1 to lumbar 2, hence the name thoracocolumbar. The preganglionic axons pass through the ventral roots to white rami communicans to the retroperitoneal sympathetic chain ganglia. What we mean by that is that the sympathetic chain ganglia lie behind the peritoneal membrane in this area of the body cavity. Okay, so they're tucked away from many of the other internal organs. The rami communicans are simply, you could think of them as on and off ramps to either access or to leave the paravertebral ganglia. And you can see here again that in the sympathetic division, the preganglionic neurons tend to be rather short, the postganglionic neurons tend to be rather long, which is the reverse of what we see in the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. So let's take a look at how the sympathetic axons get to their target. Spinal nerves originate when the dorsal and the ventral roots basically run into each other. Preganglionic neurons synapse at either the same or different level with postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic chain ganglia that lie on either side of the spinal cord. And then these postganglionic neurons exit the ganglia through the gray rami communicans, and they re-enter the spinal nerves. So you could think of them as sort of on and off ramps to these chain ganglia. The sympathetic nerves occur where the preganglionic neurons synapse at either the same or different level with postganglionic neurons, which then exit the ganglia through sympathetic nerves. Now, that's kind of a little bit of an oversimplification, because one of the things we have to understand is that there's going to be a few preganglionic neurons that are actually going to pass right through the paravertebral ganglia and the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, and those are termed splanchnic nerves, as we'll find out in just a minute. And sometimes what will happen, instead of passing through the paravertebral ganglia, is that the preganglionic neuron may move into the paravertebral ganglia through the gray rami communicans and then move either up or down the paravertebral ganglia and synapse with a postganglionic neuron that will then exit the paravertebral ganglia at a level different than where the preganglionic neuron left the spinal cord. Okay, so all we're saying there is that you can have a nerve lead that can hop into these paravertebral ganglia and either go up or go down, and then that postganglionic neuron will carry the electrical information all the way to the target. Splanchnic nerves occur as a result of the preganglionic neurons passing right through the chain ganglia without synapsing. The preganglionic axons and synapse with postganglionic neurons in collateral ganglia, what we sometimes call intramural ganglia. Intramural literally means within the walls of the body cavity. The postganglionic neurons will then send their fiber to the target, and that's how the innervation will reach the gland or the tissue or the smooth or cardiac muscle. Now, the adrenal gland is an exception to this in that the adrenal gland is part of the endocrine system, but it really is formed out of tissue that has a nervous system origin. And what happens with the adrenal gland is that preganglionic axons will actually pass right through the paravertebral ganglia and head all the way to the adrenal medulla, which is the core of the organ. And when stimulated, that'll cause the adrenal medulla to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine directly into the bloodstream. Embryologically, the adrenal medulla comes from the same cells as postganglionic autonomic nervous system cells. It's just that they've been modified so that they can secrete their products directly into the bloodstream as opposed to using the epinephrine as a neurotransmitter. So that's sort of unusual. But it also explains why, when we panic, that we don't calm down right away, because the epinephrine is still in the bloodstream, and it takes a while for the body to eliminate it so that the effects of the hormone as well as the effects of stimulation of the sympathetic division wear off. Whereas there is no counterpart in the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. There's no endocrine organ really that enhances or detracts from the effects of parasympathetic stimulation. Now, this is kind of interesting because this is one of three places really where the nervous system and the endocrine system intersect each other. The adrenal medulla, the pituitary gland, and the pineal gland all represent shared structures between the endocrine and the nervous system. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of people go to what we call holistic medicine to treat certain diseases, because the theory behind a lot of holistic medicine is that the better your mental outlook is, the more likely you are to recover from the physical symptoms of your disease. The thinking there being that a properly functioning nervous system leads to a properly functioning endocrine system, which is going to essentially allow you to retain or maintain homeostasis more effectively. And there's a lot of evidence that supports that. Examples of holistic medicine are things like massage therapy, hypnotherapy, reflexology, and so on. And they try and not so much downplay what we think of as Western medicine, which is surgery and drugs to fix physical symptoms, but to act as an adjuvant or an adjunct to it in order to improve the effectiveness. Parasympathetic or craniosacral division is organized anatomically a little bit differently. The preganglionic cell bodies in the nuclei of the brainstem or the lateral parts of the spinal cord gray matter run from S2 through S4. The preganglionic axons from the brain pass to the terminal ganglia through cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. The preganglionic axons from the sacral region pass through the pelvic splanchnic nerves to terminal ganglia, which are located near the organ, innervated, or actually can be embedded in the wall of the organ. So what we have is a very long preganglionic neuron, a relatively short postganglionic neuron. And you might say, well, why? And honestly, I don't have a real good answer for you, other than the fact that they don't share a common pathway with the sympathetic division. Perhaps there's utility in separating those nerve leads from each other, both physiologically and also anatomically. Now, the enteric nervous system consists of nerve plexuses within the wall of the digestive tract. There's a lot of neurons that are embedded along the walls of the GI. Sensory neurons connect the digestive tract to the central nervous system, and autonomic nervous system motor neurons connect the central nervous system to the digestive tract. The enteric neurons that are confined to the enteric plexus help to essentially coordinate the activity of the GI so that food, when it enters, once the voluntary act of swallowing is over, waves of smooth muscle contraction called peristalsis are going to propel that food all down the tract, and the enteric nervous system helps to coordinate those peristaltic movements, but also it helps in some ways to prepare the secretions in the digestive tract to be present before the arrival of the food so that it can be properly processed once it arrives at that point in the GI. So we call these parasympathetic reflexes, and we'll talk a little bit more about them actually when we get to the digestive system in A&P2. Let's talk about the distribution of sympathetic autonomic nervous system fibers. They reach their organs through spinal nerves that innervate things like sweat glands and the smooth muscle of blood vessels and the skeletal muscle and skin, as well as the smooth muscle which is connected to every hair in the body, known as the erector pili muscle. The head and the neck nerve plexuses innervate sweat glands, smooth muscle of blood vessels, and the skeletal muscle and the skin, as well as the erector pili muscle. And the thoracic nerve plexuses are both cardiac and pulmonary, so they innervate the heart and the lungs, while the abdominal pelvic nerve plexuses include the celiac, the celiac plexus, the superior mesenteric plexus, the inferior mesenteric plexus, the hypogastric plexus, and they primarily talk to the organs in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Now, how to remember these. Mesentery is connective tissue that suspends large portions of the digestive tract from the walls of the abdominal pelvic region. Okay, so when you see mesenteric, that means of or pertaining to mesentery. So the mesentery contains, among other things, blood vessels, lymphatics, and nerves that serve those parts of the GI. Okay, so that's one way to remember when you see mesenteric. Hypogastric should remind you of beneath the stomach. Okay, so there's a lot of nerve leads out of there that are going to talk to the upper GI and portions of the large intestine as well. And then celiac plexus, you could think of the condition known as celiac disease, which is essentially an immune response to a protein that's found in wheat and rye flour called gluten, which you've probably heard of if you've been listening to the radio or read the newspaper or magazines. And in these individuals who have celiac disease, what they have is a genetic predisposition to not be able to tolerate the gluten in wheat and rye flour very well, and it results in tremendous GI upset. So that's what celiac disease is all about. So when you think celiac nerve plexus, just remember celiac disease as being a digestive condition, and that should allow you to get a good picture in your head. Okay, make sure and go over this material. It'll be covered on an upcoming PRS quiz, and I will see everybody in the next and final podcast of the term. Talk to you soon.